If someone asked me the question, what are the biggest factors that impact the value of an agency? I typically say three things.
Welcome to the Insurance Refocused podcast, where we're highlighting real agent stories and how they are innovating to respond to the changes and challenges happening in the independent insurance industry. My name's Lindsay, and I can't wait to introduce you to my amazing co-host, who just so happens to be my mom, Carey Wallace. Mom, how you doing today?
I'm having an okay day, Lindsay. It is 74 degrees. Like after the recent crazy weather that we had, the 74 degrees does not feel bad. I'm not going to lie. How is your day going?
My day's going good. I'm finally getting to the fun part of wedding planning, which is a relief. For a while there, it was, stressful. Got to pick the venue, got to pick where the wedding's going to even be. So I'm finally to the fun parts where I get to pick out the pretty things and have fun talking to my bridesmaids. So I am doing great today. Thank you very much.
I'm glad to hear that. I got to tell you, the whole thing's supposed to be fun. I mean, my Lord, we're traveling to a beautiful part of the world in order to have this wedding. So it is, from a parent's perspective, I'm glad that it's finally being fun, because if it isn't fun, what the heck are we doing? Right?
Yeah. Well, enough wedding talk for our podcast today. For those listening, if you did not look at the podcast listing, this is again a solo episode for us. It's something we decided we wanted to start trying out in 2025, and honestly, it's fun to just get to hang out and chat with each other. And I hope this year that we'll continue doing these. And honestly, one of the things that I'd love to go through is different risk factors in these different solo episodes. There are 31, Mom? 31?
27-ish.
27-ish.
Yeah.
So 27 different risk factors that can be affecting your agency's value. So I think it's important for this podcast that we just start covering some of the risk factors, how they happen, how to mitigate them, what agencies who are really strong in this risk factor are doing. What do you think, Mom?
I would love to do that, because that's what I end up talking to agencies about almost every day, whether I'm valuing an agency or we're benchmarking an agency, or even if it's a fractional CFO client, we're trying to minimize the risk inside an agency to strengthen it and position them to have as many options as possible, position them to acquire, position them to transition, like whatever that is. But if you know what the risks are, you can start mitigating them. And if we're being real, insurance agents mitigate their clients' risks. We get to help highlight and mitigate our insurance agents' clients' risk, which is kind of cool. And I'll say this, a lot of agency owners don't think about their agency's risk. They think about getting the work done for their clients. So I love that we can do these brief conversations to help think about their business in a different way. Because if you don't think about it and you get to the point where you want to sell or you want to transition and you aren't aware of what your risk factors are, you can't change them to increase the value of your agency. So the point is, if we can highlight it early, you can do something about some of these risk factors, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So the one I want to kick off with is something we've been talking with our team internally about a lot lately, is transferability. Mm-hmm. So I know that there are a couple of things that go into the risk factor of transferability. Will you just, for our listeners, give a brief, what is transferability and why should an agency owner care about it?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with, if someone asks me the question, what are the biggest factors that impact the value of an agency? I typically say three things. I say, is the agency growing? Is the agency profitable? And is the agency transferable? Growth and profitability, we can probably talk about in a different episode and dig into all the things to think about, because not all growth is the same. Not all profitability is the same, but there's lots of things to think about. But transferability is the one that people, they might scratch their head and say, I don't really know what the heck she means by that. And a lot of the other risk factors will contribute to whether or not an agency is transferable. So what I mean by transferability is if the whole idea about a value of an agency is, will the performance of this agency continue to be expected into the future? And if not, what is keeping the agency's future performance from being predictable? So is it able to operate the same way in the future? And if it's not, something's causing the transferability to, or that performance to be at risk. So will it transfer if the owner shifts, or if a key relationship shifts, or if a key producer changes being part of the agency? So transferability is about the predictability of the ongoing performance of the agency.
So that's a super interesting topic. And if a, buyer was thinking about that, I think that would be amazing. But when you're just day to day running your agency and you're not actually thinking about, selling your agency, I could see how that's an incredibly large risk factor that you're not even thinking about, right? Like that's like your smoke detectors, batteries in your house. Like I can remember the last time. I'm actually going to have to probably tell Patrick to check those now that I've thought of it. It's just something you never think about. So tell me about an agency, and you don't have to name them or anything, but tell me about an agency, what an agency looks like that has a strong transferability.
Sure. It's really easy to highlight the ones that aren't. Like the weaknesses are easy to see when someone lays it out, but I'll describe an agency that has a high transferability, and maybe I'll contrast it with one that doesn't. So if you had two agencies, both are $1.5 million, $2 million in revenue, and one agency A has two owners. It has 4 producers. Each of those producers make up 25% of the total production of that agency. They use an agency management system. They have a CRM. And each of those 4 producers hunt for new business, but they also have referral partners in place. The other thing I'd say is they have a strong online presence that generates some leads for the agency as well. I've just described an agency that does not have all of its eggs in one basket from many of the different categories that we're talking about. If I told you, though, that same agency, both producers are past retirement age, and both owners are past retirement age, and every producer is also in their 70s, do you feel the same way you just did when I talked about it versus now that I've told you everybody's past retirement age?
Well, but wouldn't this depend on the buyer though? Because some buyers are looking to buy a book and they don't necessarily want to buy not buy the employees. I get that's a terrible way to phrase that, but they don't necessarily aren't looking for employees to come on. So how does that impact the risk factor?
So if I'm going to buy an agency, and first of all, I want the book to be as healthy as possible, and I want it to be as diverse as possible. So whether it's a personal lines book or a commercial lines books matters. But if that producer is in its 70s, most likely those clients are within 1 decade of that producer's age. So you sell to people that look and feel just like you. So your book is going to be reflective of your age, and my book is going to be reflective of my age. All other things being equal. I'm not saying there are not exceptions to the rule, but if every one of those 4 producers and the owners are all in their 70s, the likelihood of their clients also being in their 80s, 70s, and 60s is very high. And that is a different health and makeup of book than someone who has a producer that's in his 30s, a producer in his 40s, producer in its 50s, and a producer in its 70s. That's a much healthier and diverse book than the one that I just described. That's number one. Number two is we are in a relationship-driven industry. If everyone's going to exit, the owners and the producers in the same period of time, let's say 2-year period, those relationships with the referral partners and the customers would be at risk because it'd be tough to transition all of those relationships at the same time. And the retention of that book and the sources of new business might be in jeopardy. So you want something that's demographically diverse. So therefore you'd have some continuity in that book. But if I left those ages out, you would think not more than 25% with one producer. It's not that big of a risk. It's much less risky than an agency that has one producer that makes up 80% of the book, right? So there's degrees of risk, but that's one example of, on the surface, it looks really healthy until you start digging a little deeper and you now know that you're going to lose some serious talent in that agency and potentially relationships that could impact the retention of that book. It would definitely put a question mark around the future ongoing performance from a retention standpoint and a new business standpoint, just knowing the age demographic. And that's literally only one example, right?
Yeah. So what about, you know, one of the things we've been talking about a lot on here lately is picking a niche, because the hard market is practically forcing agencies to do this. Being a general agency is just incredibly hard, generalist agency. How do niches play into this? Is this something that, you know, would go into the transferability? Because I would assume if you know, have a staff who has chosen to be incredibly focused in one area, would that help or hurt you?
Yeah. So I love agencies that have a niche, no question about it, but it depends on it. That answer is 100% it depends, because not all niches are created equal. And not everybody defines what a true niche is. Some people say we have a concentration of contractors. Well, I can find you a lot of agencies that have the ability and the markets to write contractors. What I mean by niche is it is a program that is exclusive to you, or it is a segment of the market that needs some expertise or some very specialized maybe markets, you know, whatever that is. That it is there's a talent, there's an expertise, and maybe there's access that is unique to that line, or it's a heavy concentration of something that not a lot of people are in. That could create high efficiency, high profitability inside that agency. But the reality is not every agency would be prepared to buy that agency's book, because they might not have the expertise, markets, or talent in order to know how to be successful in that particular niche. So while it can create high profitability, high efficiency, here's the beautiful part about our industry, though. Not every agency would be perfect to buy that agency that has a niche, but the good news is there's so many more buyers than there are sellers. There's plenty of buyers out there that are probably well positioned to take that over. It might not be the agency right across the street, and it may not be, 50 agencies that are saying, "Hey, I'm interested." But you also need to be very careful as the seller picking the right buyer to make sure that there's continuity in your book, that they are the right buyer for that book of business. So it definitely will change who your potential buyers are if it's a true niche, because you might not be able to gain access to that program. You might not have that talent. So perfect example. Here's the other big one that, I want to make sure that people talk about, because there's some cultural things that cause the transferability of an agency to differ. So many agencies have agency management systems. Some agencies use CRMs. You can't make the assumption that one agency that's on Hawksoft is absolutely transferable to another agency that's on Hawksoft. They might use their technology completely differently. They might have different expectations. Yes, that's a commonality, and it's more likely that they'll be able to communicate with each other and at least have some level of understanding of that system. But you really have to know how does one operate versus the other, and what are the deal breakers in that situation? Because the last thing you want to do as an agency owner that's super tech forward and very sales oriented driven is acquire an agency that's very service driven that maybe isn't as tech forward. Even though the systems are exactly the same, that cultural difference is so big that you're going to potentially frustrate your current staff when you bring on other staff that are not wired to think about the process the same way. And you might actually be really excited about getting new talent to come onto your team, only to find that they're not going to assimilate into your team because the cultural differences are so big. Does that make sense? So you have to really think about it and listen and hear, how do you engage with your clients? What do you utilize your technology for? What are the goals? How do you measure the goals? Like, you got to get a feel for the cultural to know if that's something that's truly transferable to your culture. And if it's not, maybe that's not the right acquisition for you.
As you've been saying that, I've been thinking about a couple of different agencies that I've heard that are, I've always explained it as doing cool things, like doing things outside of the norm. When you hear about these agencies that are doing things outside of the norm with their technology, do you internally cringe? Like, ooh, that's going to be a bad decision? How do you know what's going to be this is something really cool that is going to really streamline my agency, like using a tech that's not normally, used for insurance, but implementing it into your agency, or, building a cool process with AI on top of something? How do you know what's going to hurt or help your transferability?
Yeah. So what's funny is I was just texting with him this morning, so I don't mind mentioning his name. Jeff Roy is a super good friend of mine. Una Roy is super good. But when I think tech forward agency, I think Jeff Roy. I think of a lot of people, like, don't get me wrong, but he one time put up a slide at an event of all the tech that he was using inside his agency. And I think it was like, over 70 pieces of tech. I have no idea. I didn't count it. Maybe it's only 50, but my point was the slide had so many different things on it that it was intimidating to anybody that isn't tech forward. So yes, and part of me says the average agency can't buy his agency. Like, they just can't. But what I really think is the people that know how to use that tech are super valuable in a transition, because now they can change who buys them and actually help that efficiency spread to the buyer. But the tech without the people becomes a hindrance, because they might not know how to continue to operate that machine. So I don't think he would mind me saying that at all. Like, he and his team are incredibly valuable in conjunction with the tech that they've put into their agency. And that's true for any agency that has leveraged, RPA technology, like understanding how that changes your process. You need the people that know how to use it, because the acquirer who wants to also potentially be efficient would need those people to help implement it, right? Tech doesn't happen by itself. So, yeah.
Interesting. Are there any examples of someone you've heard doing something that you're like, oh, don't do that, that's going to really hurt your transferability?
I think that building your own system and, doing it in a way that if you're not there, there's nobody that can figure it out in your absence might be a problem. So I guess my answer would be, if you're an agency that's built something proprietary to your agency and you wait to sell your agency until you want to drop the keys and walk away, you've got to understand that even though it operates that way under your watch, it may not to your buyer, and therefore they may discount it because they're not going to assume all of those things are going to continue to work in your absence. And that's true for a lot of things. Like, somebody who wants to get the maximum amount for their agency needs to stay in transfer staff relationships, referral partner relationships, carrier relationships, like a lot of different things matter. So you change your own transferability of your agency if you wait too long and say, as of the sale date, I'd like to go sit on a beach somewhere. That will change the ability of the buyer to expect the agency to continue to operate the way that it has been, to have the same retention rate, to have the same new business rate, maybe even have the same talent inside the agency, because there's a lot of loyalty to, I want to work for this person, and when they leave, I'm not 100% sure I like change. Change makes a lot of people think this might be the opportunity for me to make a change too. So that continuity is important. So I guess, and it's not just for the owner. If you have a key producer in your agency and they don't stay with you and it makes up a significant amount of the book, that is an area of risk for an agency who's buying you. Same thing if you have a key client that makes up a large percentage of your book. If that one relationship goes away and it makes up, 20% of your book, that's a significant shift of what you've bought. So providing continuity becomes a really, really important area of focus.
Are there any other like really big areas that we haven't talked about yet? Because I feel like we've talked about culture a bit. We've talked about concentration with, the niche, with carrier relationships. What else?
So, it used to be that agents would target acquisitions because they wanted to get carrier appointments, right? And so if they could find another agency that had a carrier appointment that they didn't have, it would be a great opportunity. They might even pay a premium because they want that appointment and they want that book. It's something that they've been trying to do. This hard market's kind of changed that ability to make that kind of strategic move through an acquisition, because some carriers are not very likely to hand out new contracts to people that are unproven, that they don't have a relationship with. So I think that's changed a little bit. There's plenty of people out there that have the same contracts as you that would be potentially good buyers, but the hard market's changed that a little bit, where that strategy can backfire. And if you aren't sure whether or not you're going to get those contracts, you could be buying a book roll, which would be very different than buying the carrier contract that you thought you wanted. So
absolutely.
I also think it's important. Don't assume what someone did 4 years ago and worked, and strategy applies in the middle of a hard market. The game is changing constantly, and there is a lot of different factors to consider, and making sure you have a clear picture of that prior to signing on the dotted line and you don't have a surprise at the end of what you bought is really important. But transferability, it can be, the degrees of transferability in an agency can vary based on the combination of factors as well. So having someone look at it objectively and help you weigh the transferability risk of an agency, I think is incredibly important. And it also can change based on the buyer's makeup and the seller's makeup, that what is a risk in one might be less of a risk when you combine it with another book. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic. And it's one that, in my opinion, I think it gets overlooked quite a bit, because growth and profitability are really easy. Those are numbers, but this has a lot of things that go into it.
All right. So if you could summarize transferability for me in 3, 4, 5 sentences, how would you describe transferability to a third grader?
Ooh,
maybe not a third grader, a high schooler.
Okay. So transferability is the predictability of ongoing performance of an agency. Let's just say that. And all the factors that go into what might enhance performance and what might actually impede performance if any of those things change in the future.
Nice. What
you
are
think
the
a third grader could get that?
I think, well, maybe a high schooler.
Maybe.
If you could summarize what the things that go into transferability are as well.
Yeah. The biggest things are area of concentration, like what is the culture of the agency? How do you approach your customer relationships? What's the technology that you use? What are the contracts that are in place? What are those referral relationships? And what are your carrier relationships? Like, honestly, concentration of the book, concentration with producers, relationship with your staff, all of those things factor into the transferability of and the ongoing performance of the agency.
Awesome. Well, I think for our first episode covering a risk factor, we went pretty deep in some areas, but we covered them all. Is there anything that you're like, I need our listeners to know this about transferability before we log off?
I would just say, think about your business as if you were buying your agency. And if you were going to buy it and you weren't going to be there, what would keep you up at night? What are the things that might keep the agency from operating the right way? And if you can step out of your agency and look at it that way, you're going to know what your transferability risks are compared to somebody else. And if you just try to look at what other people's transferability risks are, you're going to be very, very disappointed, because this is not something that's a one size fits all. It is very personal to each and every agency. And the degree of transferability risk is different based on each and every agency. So, it's a good exercise to do a health checkup of your agency and think about it from, what would I think if I was buying this agency?
Very good. Very good. All right. Well, what risk factor should we do on our next solo episode, do you think?
Yeah, I think let's look at all the different concentration ones and give some examples there, because I think sometimes that is an easy, and we can do a couple different concentrations and how they compound inside an agency and provide some cool stories about that.
Cool. Well, to our listeners, tune in next time for risk factors on concentration, and we'll see you there. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Linz.
Thanks so much for tuning in to the Insurance Refocused podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please be sure to hit subscribe and leave us a review so you'll never miss us. Want to learn more about how Agency Focus can help you grow your agency? Head to agency-focus.com or email Carey directly at carey@agency-focus.com. If you need to get in touch with me, feel free to shoot me an email at lindsay@agency-focus.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll see you next week.